Did you ever wonder why almost everyone shows up to a funeral wearing black, even if the person who died never asked for it? It's one of those traditions we follow without really thinking. Someone passes away, and suddenly, closets all over the world open in search of the darkest clothing we own. But here's the strange part. For most of human history, people didn't wear black to funerals at all. In fact, the reason we do it today has more to do with medieval fashion, royal drama, and one extremely influential queen than with mourning itself. If you walked into a funeral in ancient Rome, you wouldn't see neat rows of black suits and dresses. Instead, mourners wore something called a toga pola, which was actually a faded, dirty-looking garment. It wasn't black by design. It was simply clothing that had been darkened with age or dyed to look dull and somber. The goal wasn't elegance. It was to show that life had temporarily lost its color. In ancient Egypt, the color of mourning was completely different. Egyptians often associated mourning with yellow or sometimes white linen, reflecting the sands of the desert and the belief that death was part of a cycle leading to rebirth. Meanwhile, in parts of ancient Asia, white became the traditional color of mourning because it symbolized purity and the transition to the afterlife. So if all these different cultures mourned in different colors, how did black end up winning? The answer starts in medieval Europe, where black clothing was surprisingly rare and incredibly expensive. Producing deep black dye required complex mixtures of tannins, iron salts, and repeated dyeing processes. Only the wealthy could afford fabrics dyed well enough to stay black rather than turning gray or brown. And that meant something interesting happened. Black clothing slowly became associated with power, wealth, and seriousness, rather than grief. By the late Middle Ages, European nobles began wearing black for formal events because it projected dignity and authority. Kings and high-ranking officials adopted black garments to show prestige. In other words, black was once less about sadness and more about status. But the funeral connection was about to change dramatically. In 1861, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died unexpectedly. Victoria was devastated. And instead of observing a brief mourning period like many monarchs before her, she wore black for the rest of her life. Not for a year, not for 5 years, for 40 years. Victoria's grief became a public symbol across the British Empire. Every portrait, every public appearance, every royal image showed her dressed in black. Because she was one of the most influential figures in the world at the time, her personal mourning style quietly reshaped social expectations. Suddenly, black clothing wasn't just dignified, it became the proper uniform of grief. And people took the rules seriously. Victorian mourning etiquette became so detailed it almost reads like a rule book. Widows were expected to wear full black clothing, called deep mourning, for up to 2 years. During this time, fabrics had to be matte and dull, avoiding shiny materials that might seem cheerful. Jewelry was often made from jet, a black fossilized stone, or even woven from the hair of the deceased. But here's where things get even stranger. After deep mourning came something called half mourning. That meant people slowly reintroduced muted colors like gray, lavender, and dull purple as they transitioned back to normal life. Society literally had stages for how much sadness your wardrobe should display. Imagine having an official timeline for your grief, measured in fabric colors. But even today, the tradition isn't universal. In Japan, funeral clothing is typically black now due to Western influence, but historically, mourners wore white. In many African cultures, funerals are colorful celebrations of life rather than solemn black gatherings. And in Mexico, during Dia de los Muertos, bright colors and decorated skulls are used to honor the dead in joyful remembrance. So the next time you see a room full of people dressed in black at a funeral, remember something surprising. That tradition didn't come from ancient wisdom about grief. It came from expensive medieval dye, social status among European nobles, and the heartbreak of one queen whose mourning lasted 4 decades. A fashion trend, a royal tragedy, and a cultural ripple that quietly spread across the world. History has a strange way of turning personal grief into global tradition. And sometimes the clothes we wear to say goodbye carry stories most people never realize they're wearing. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories behind our traditions.